So, welcome everyone. Good to see you. This week's topic is happiness and suffering. And so today we start with suffering. Now, the whole teaching revolves around suffering and the end of suffering. That's the whole point why we do whatever we do. It's the point why you're stretching your body right now, why you try to make yourself comfortable, find a new job, quit your relationship, find a new relationship, eat, sleep. Whatever it is that we do is based upon the desire for the end of stress, the end of suffering. And that's great. Wonderful that we have that. It's very, very good. It's a very good desire to have, the end of suffering. And so, what is suffering, first of all? Well, suffering as, for example, the Buddha defines it as birth, old age, illness, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair, encountering what one doesn't like or one doesn't want, being separated from the loved and having to face the unloved. In short, you can say just the basic fact of having such a body and mind on the most subtle level. This is all suffering. Now, depending on how refined your view is, your vision is, your seeing is, you will see various degrees of suffering. So, for example, for most of us, we would all agree that a headache is suffering. It's painful experience. Having to endure a loss, any form of loss, either the loss of our health, the loss of what we love, etc., that is suffering. Worrying is suffering, right? Depression is suffering. Grief, misery, all that is suffering, and we would all agree that there is so much suffering in this world. There's torture, there's war, there's hunger, there's inequality. All that we would readily accept as saying, yes, that this is suffering, for sure. Right? So this is a relatively coarse form of suffering. It gets more subtle. The more you look, the closer you look, the more subtle it becomes. And it goes all the way down to the most refined form of restlessness. Just not being at ease. This is difficult to see, not being at ease. But you start to see that when you become quiet and you sit down and you try to rest your mind. And you notice that the mind continuously moves. Your attention continuously moves. This is this desire for the end of suffering. It's that. Our mind, our attention is continuously, from second to second, nanosecond to nanosecond, scanning for some form of relief. And usually we do not notice that. Why not? Because we distract ourselves. We keep ourselves busy most of the time, so we do not notice our basic discomfort. The discomfort with this moment. The discomfort with the way it is. The discomfort with truth. Then I'm saying that is very, very subtle. So many of you might say, well, no, I'm not suffering. I have a very nice life. But then again, yes, that might be true on the superficial level. It might be very true. We all do have a very nice life, actually. It's just alone the fact that we have the leisure to sit here together and discuss high-minded topics such as these. That is a fact that we are doing quite well, actually. We have a roof on our head. We have enough to eat, so much so that we can throw away food. We're doing pretty well. Yes. So on that level, yes. Particularly, we're quite fine. But then if you sit down and you actually face yourself, you actually look at yourself, then you will quickly notice just how restless we actually are. And that is something we don't notice. When we're just thinking, okay, my life is actually quite nice, I'm enjoying it. You're right thinking that. Your life is quite nice. Yes. But underneath that niceness, if you actually stop distracting yourself, as long as we do have our toys, as long as we do have things to distract ourselves, we feel like as if we were fine. We don't notice the underlying driving force that forces us to constantly distract ourselves. So that is suffering. The word suffering, dukkha, originally there's some scholars that say it comes from, it's two word. You have a prefix which is du, and then you have the word ka. Ka means something like empty or like a hole. Yes? And du means not fitting. So it would originally point to the axle hole of a wheel. You have the axle hole of a wheel. If that is just slightly off to the side, you're going to have a bumpy ride. It's just a hole. There's nothing in it, right? But if it's just slightly off to the side, it's uncomfortable. So dukkha refers to this axle hole, which is kind of slightly misaligned. So that's our experience of life. It's a bumpy ride. The happiness that we have doesn't stay, ever. And it always comes with a problem together. Like we might buy a nice shirt and we enjoy our new shirt. A week later we read an article about where our shirts are coming from. Outrage. I wouldn't have thought that my shirt comes from there. Let's boycott, I don't know, H&M or whoever, you know. I'm not buying their shirts anymore. Every single thing that we enjoy also comes with a downside. But we usually don't see that. Like the famous example of birth and death. We would celebrate birth every year, happily, with balloons and funny hats and, you know, these kind of things. But we don't do that with death. We don't celebrate death. In fact, we're really scared of death. Death seems to be kind of like the bad thing, and birth seems to be the good thing. I'm saying seems to be. It appears like that. If things appear a certain way, it doesn't mean that they necessarily are that way as they appear. And that shows that we don't really deal quite well with this duality of life. So we chase the cause of suffering, believing that it is nice. So we are chasing after birth, thinking that it's going to be awesome to be born. And then we are outraged at the fact that it comes with death. It's like eating rotten food because it smells really good, then only to find out a day later it was rotten. It smelled really good, it tasted quite good, but it was actually rotten. And so then there comes regret. I wish I wouldn't have eaten that. Right? So many of our pleasures are actually like that. They're kind of, we're getting something that we think is going to really solve all our problems, it's going to be amazing, it's going to be nice. We get it, and as we get it, with it come all the problems as well. But the mind doesn't want to see that. It only wants to see that once I get that, my life will be happy. It's very simple there. Once I get the new relationship, my life will be happy. Then you get the new relationship and you find out nothing really has changed. Nothing really has changed. It's kind of the same thing. Like changing our posture, my favorite example, changing our posture. You can change it 100,000 times and it will give you the same thing again and again, doesn't it? There is no ultimate posture change that you can make so that you will never experience any pain ever anymore. In fact, every change of your posture leads to a different type of pain. You can see it like that, right? So I call that ordinary happiness. Ordinary happiness is characterized by the fact that it A, always comes with a problem, and B, it never lasts. But it's fine and we need it. That's important to say that too. I'm not saying don't strive for ordinary happiness. You have to, because otherwise you die. Like, okay, ordinary happiness, I shouldn't eat anymore, I shouldn't sleep anymore, I shouldn't change my posture anymore. Well, try. They will end up in a huge amount of suffering. So we need to constantly change. It's in the nature of life. So when talking about suffering, we can talk about it on 3 levels, right? We have the ordinary suffering, we all know that, which is just simply called the suffering of suffering. What is that? Well, headaches, injuries, loss, all the stuff that you would consider to be uncomfortable, you can put into that category. Anything you dislike, that's the suffering of suffering. Easy, right? That's the first one, and we all in this room, everybody would agree, yes, that is suffering. The second type is a bit more subtle, because it's what we consider to be pleasurable, what we consider to be nice. But it's also in a category of suffering. It's just much more subtle. How so? It's called the suffering of change. So everything that we do ever in life, like our seated posture, whatever we do, we just simply shift around problems. We're not really solving them. We just shift the pain around. You know that saying, wherever you go, there you are? Right? And so wherever you go, if you carry a lot of suffering in your mind, wherever you go, it'll be unpleasant. The place around you will not be the solution. It apparently might look like the solution for a little while, but then soon, when the distraction when the veil lifts, then you will notice, wow, my whole suffering is still there. My uneasy mind is still there. Wherever you go, there is this uneasy mind. And no place, no company, no stuff in the world can ever solve that. Nothing you could ever consume can solve the uneasy mind. In fact, very often it feeds the uneasy mind. It makes it stronger, it makes it broader, it makes it grow. So many of the products we consume, they can only be sold by giving you the idea that the way you are or what you have is not enough. Therefore, you must have that. And then it'll be enough. And then we go and get it and then find out later on, again, it was just another thing. And so all the pleasures that we could have in our life are just like that. Reflect back on your own life. I don't want you to believe in what I say, ever. Just reflect on your own life. You've experienced many nice things, I bet. You've seen beautiful sunrises, sunsets. You had amazing conversations. You were traveling, meeting interesting people. Lots of good things, right? Did any of that last? Did any of the positive feelings that you ever had in life last? So that you got that feeling and then it just stayed with you and it's still there now. It's not, right? There's nothing like that. It's like asking, have you ever experienced a day where the sun just stayed in the sky forever after? No. Every day is followed by night. And so there were many days and many nights. The same with our happiness and our suffering. We can also say the way we experience relief and suffering. So this second type of suffering is kind of like the suffering of change, or you could also say the suffering of relief. We're experiencing that suffering, and based upon the intensity of that suffering, we enjoy its relief. Like a friend of mine said one time, it's like walking in tiny shoes. We like doing that. We like walking in tiny shoes. Why? Because it's so nice taking them off. That's our reasoning. Like, let me walk 10 miles in tiny shoes. Why would you do this? Well, it's so nice taking them off. We knock ourselves out at a tough job that we hate. Why? So we can afford the holiday. Or something like that, you know. So every relief, every pleasure that we experience, the intensity of the pleasure depends on the intensity of the pain which came before it. The relief is in accordance with that. It's in alignment with that. And that is what we usually consider happiness. We say, that's nice. I loved it. But ask yourself further, what helped you to love that situation so much? And you will always find it's because of a previous thirst, a previous hunger, a previous itch. There's an itch, that's why it's nice to scratch. If it wasn't for the itch, scratching is like, it's pointless. But if you're really itchy, wow, so nice to scratch. Some of the masters, they compare our way of actually dealing with suffering like picking on scabs. We have a scab and we're kind of like picking on it constantly. We're not allowing the wound to heal because we're constantly picking on it. Oh, there's a scab, so we try to get rid of it, making it worse, making it last, maybe even infecting the wound. Instead, what the Buddha recommends in terms of suffering would be to comprehend it. Is a recommendation, and that's really the challenge with meditation practice, to comprehend suffering. What does that imply? Do you have to read books about suffering? Does that mean you comprehend it? Now I know what it is. Or do you have to study it? Do you have to do an online course on suffering? Is that comprehending it? No. Truly comprehending suffering means having the guts to not run away, to face it. And where is it? It's right inside of you. What do you need to do? Look. Understand it. Understand yourself. And that's what we kind of try to avoid, right? We try to get out of that situation where we have to face ourselves, our own discomfort. We don't really want that. The greater the discomfort, the more we try to avoid it. That's why meditation is shadow work. You have to look at what is yet to be illuminated. You have to see the problem clearly. And how you are making it, how you're sustaining it, how you are recreating it every moment. If you see that clearly enough, what will happen? You understand its cause. You understand why you suffer. Right? And when you understand why, then you have a fair chance at letting go of the cause of suffering. And if you let go of the cause of suffering, what happens to suffering? It stops. But as long as you're not letting go of its cause, it continues. Yes, and so in meditation we learn to observe ourselves, to sit down and to actually look. And the first thing you will encounter is the suffering of suffering. Yeah, my knees hurt, my back hurts. When is the session over? This is unbearable. It's so boring, you know. Just breathing in, breathing out. Oh God, you get tired. Voila, that's the suffering of suffering. Are you outside of that, or do you have to experience it against your will? Sure do. We all do. That gives you a chance to understand that we're all in the same. With that, you become compassionate. You see, oh, we're all in the same boat. We're all experiencing the same kind of misery. And we're all trying not to. That gives us a chance to connect with one another on a deeper level. Compassion only makes sense upon comprehension of suffering. Otherwise it doesn't make any sense. If you don't really understand how we make ourselves uncomfortable continuously, you can't understand other people. We're all doing the same. And then after a while you will discover the second type of suffering. That when pleasurable states finally arise in your meditation practice, your mind becomes really still, really nice. But it doesn't last either, and is unreliable. Every single time, you have all these delusions, all these problems in daily life, and then you sit down, you have a wonderful meditation session, and you come out and the problems are right back in your face. It's that very intense duality then. You see, wow, the great bliss of meditation practice and the fact of having to deal with this body, being forced having to deal with this heavy body, with this heavy mind, with this heavy life, where I have to constantly do stuff. Then your view, your mind is so empowered, your seeing becomes very clear. You see into suffering much more clearly. You see the refined forms of it. That restlessness, which is that third suffering, the so-called suffering of the five aggregates. The suffering that we constantly identify, hold on to, stuff that is not really worthy of holding on to. Like, let's give you a simple example, worry. Why do you hold on to it? What's the point? Why make yourself miserable when you could have a wonderful night's sleep? Why do you hold on to? Because you kind of have to. I say kind of. It's almost like an impulse. It's a habit, a very, very ancient habit of constantly being identified with stuff like that. Worry, anger. This is what the Buddha refers to as the aggregates, is the body and the mind, basically. So all the stuff in the body, you have to experience it, and we identify with it. And all the stuff in the mind, we have to experience it, we're identified with it continuously. We're lost in it. That's because we don't know ourselves. So we're identified with passing things that pass through, actually. That pass through your consciousness. Really without leaving a trace. But what makes these things heavy is that we're hopping into them, we're riding them, we're identified with them. That's what makes it heavy. That's the origin of all suffering. Identification. Self-identification. Not, oh, there is a bit of anger passing through. Not my business. We go, I'm so pissed right now. I hate this. There's a lot of I. Instead of just seeing, okay, an emotion, it just passes through. We latch onto it, we carry it, we put it on. And with putting it on, we're putting on all the problems that come from it by expressing it, etc. So what can we do? Well, again, we need to learn to see, to sit down and see very clearly. And in order to see very clearly, you need to sharpen your eyes. And how do you sharpen your eyes? Well, simple. You do breathing meditation. You stabilize the mind. Just like we did today. We didn't go all the way to the breath. That was almost the preparation to go to the breath. We went all the way up to stage 3, silent present moment awareness. But all that is already stilling the mind. If the mind becomes much more quiet, then you go to the breath. And then you kind of become one with this breathing. More and more. Everything becomes more and more still. The way your attention moves around becomes more and more slow. In the beginning it buzzes around like crazy. Goes from thought to sound to feeling, back and forth. Eventually it becomes more and more slow. And then it starts to rest with just one thing, with the breath. So your mind is empowered by that. That single-pointedness gives your mind power. It lifts the mind up. And as it lifts the mind up, you can then use your mind. It's like sharpening a pencil. So the meditation that we practice is like you're sharpening your pencil. You're not just sharpening a pencil so you have a sharp pencil. So what's the point of sharpening a pencil? So you can write with it or draw with it. So the same with your mind. You sharpen it, you make it nice and quiet. So you can see very clearly. Once the observer is still, then what is observed can be very clearly seen as unstable, unreliable, burdensome, not worthy of identifying with. But as long as you're moving around with the stuff in your consciousness, you can't see that. You know, when you have people who are new to making YouTube videos, and they would run around with their camera and just shake their camera in all directions. Here's the nice family vacation on the beach, and you have daddy holding the camera, running after the children with the camera, and everything is constantly shaking. That is bad videography. So if you have good videography, it means you need to stabilize the camera in some way. You might still use a shaky camera for dramatic effects. Many movies do that. But the still camera allows you to see movement, which is the point in a movie. You can see movement. You can see people walk down the beach. You can't really properly see that if the camera moves with them. This is a bit of a shaky example here, but I think you get my point. So we want to stabilize the lens. And as your lens is nicely stable, then you can see thoughts do not last. Feelings do not last. Emotions are not me or mine. They're just emotions passing through. We cannot see that if we latch on to every single thing that comes and goes. And in accordance with a quiet mind like that, you will see movement as suffering. Even the higher forms of bliss in meditation practice become kind of like itchy after a while that you're experiencing them. You might experience some initial bliss and you notice it's very unstable, it's kind of like, in a way, nervous. So you quickly lose your interest and you aim for higher forms of bliss. As my teacher said one time, I think it's a very, very nice way of putting it, the path is in letting go of inferior forms of happiness for the sake of reaching superior forms of happiness. I like to put it that way. There's a lot of talk about suffering in Buddhism. It might feel disheartening, it might feel like, oh, it's so negative, that's so depressing. It isn't really. It's a path of one happiness being replaced by a higher happiness, that one being replaced by even a higher one. What is happiness? Just short. We go into that, of course, on Monday evening, but happiness, in short, is just simply the absence of suffering. To the degree of absence of stress and suffering, that's how happy you are. It's like, how much light is there today? Well, it depends on the clouds. You take away all the clouds, there's a lot of light. You don't have to make the light, right? It kind of painted over the clouds or something. It's there. It's just obstructed. We don't see it. So in a similar way, happiness is obstructed right now because we're carrying all that rubbish around with ourselves. And as soon as you learn to drop it, oh, it's very nice. And that's what we do in meditation, gradually learning how to drop more and more suffering. You don't drop suffering all at once, all of it together. It's impossible. But you drop it gradually. Sorry, probably that's a bit of a mistake to say it's impossible. Some people might drop it at once, apparently. I guess they've all done some previous work. But yet it's a gradual process. You drop suffering gradually. And then you pick it up again, then you drop it again. And you pick it up just shortly, and then you drop it again. So it's kind of like that. Okay? So that's all that comes to mind concerning suffering.